The wire confirmation arrived on a Thursday afternoon in November, and I stared at it for so long that the screen went dark, and I had to touch it again to make sure I hadn't imagined the number. $4,200,000 Canadian. I had refreshed the portal 3 times. The number stayed. My hands were doing something strange, not shaking exactly, more like a low-frequency vibration I could feel in my wrists and nowhere else. I had been sitting at my kitchen table in Mississauga with a cold cup of tea for the better part of an hour, and I couldn't tell you what I'd been thinking during any of it. Maybe nothing. Maybe just that number, cycling through me like a phrase in a language I was only beginning to understand. 7 years. That's how long it took to build a supply chain software company from a whiteboard in a spare bedroom to something someone else wanted badly enough to pay $4.2 million for. 7 years of missed Christmases and skipped vacations, of eating toast for dinner and renegotiating invoices on Friday nights, of building something from nothing, while the rest of the world seemed to be living a life I kept deferring. My name is Bridget. I was 31 years old, and the very first thing I wanted to do was call my brother and my aunt and tell them it was over, that we could breathe now, that everything was going to be okay. That instinct, that reflex, is the thing I want you to understand, because it explains everything about who I was before that Thursday, and everything about what I was about to find out. I picked up my phone. My husband, Reed, was already standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. He hadn't said anything yet. His face wasn't the face I expected. No wide grin, no reaching for me, none of the relief I had been bracing myself to fall into. He looked deliberate, still in a way that felt like he had already done the thinking I hadn't reached yet. He crossed to the table and sat down across from me. He put his hand over mine. "Don't call them yet," he said, "not with the real news." I looked at him. "Tell them the deal fell apart," he said. "Tell them the acquisition collapsed at closing, that there was a legal dispute over the IP, and that you now owe more to the creditors than the business was ever worth. Tell them you're filing for protection under the BIA. The BIA, the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act." I knew what those letters meant. I thought he was being strange or cruel. The smile I was waiting for never arrived. "One phone call," he said. "That's all I'm asking. One conversation before you hand anything over to anyone. Let the truth come out on its own." I had been with Reed for 5 years. In 5 years, he had never once given me advice that turned out wrong. He was the person who had told me, in the very early days, that my software idea was worth protecting, before I had even thought to file for a patent. He had driven me to pitch meetings when my car was in the shop. He had stayed up until 2 in the morning, proofreading investor decks. I was too exhausted to read straight. He had earned every fraction of the trust I was holding in that kitchen. So I pressed speakerphone, and I told my brother and my aunt that everything had collapsed. What happened next, I want you to really sit with. Not just the facts of it, but the texture. The way a whole life of assumptions can dissolve in a single conversation. My brother did not ask if I was okay. He did not say, "Come stay with us," or "We'll figure this out together," or any of the things you expect to hear when someone you love calls you in crisis. His first question, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm something, was about the car. "The Pathfinder," he said. "It's still in both our names. Can creditors come after it if I've been the one making payments?" He had not been the one making payments. For 14 months after he defaulted, on the loan we'd co-signed together, I had covered his missed payments. $18,000 in total, without bringing it up once, because I thought that was what you did for family. He knew this. He also knew the car was now worth less than half its original value. What he was really asking, underneath the words, was whether he could transfer ownership before anyone came looking. Before I could answer, a text arrived from my aunt. I read it once with Reed looking over my shoulder. "Sweetheart, I hate to bring this up right now, but I do need to know. Did you ever update your RRSP beneficiary designations? I only ask because if things go sideways legally, I want to understand what I might be facing. As your family, I could potentially be implicated." She could potentially be implicated. I put the phone face down on the table. Reed said nothing. He just looked at me with that same deliberate stillness, and I understood, without either of us saying a word, that he had already known this was coming. Over the next 3 days, I went back through my bank records, not to count what I had, but to understand what I'd given. The paper trail was patient and thorough in the way that money always is. $28,000 for my brother's student loan balance when he finished his business degree. He had called me on a Tuesday night, overwhelmed and embarrassed, and I had wired the money the next morning without asking when or whether he'd pay it back. He never did, and I never asked. $18,000 in missed payments on the car loan we'd co-signed. Each month I covered, I told myself it was temporary. $22,000 for my aunt's property tax arrears, 3 years ago. She had been in danger of losing her house, a semi-detached in Brampton, that had been in the family since my grandmother bought it in 1987. I sent the money the same week she called. The following month, her kitchen was gutted and renovated. New cabinetry, quartz countertops, a farmhouse sink she had shown me in a magazine, with a note that said, "This is what a real kitchen looks like, isn't it beautiful?" She mentioned the renovation once, in passing. She did not mention where the money had come from to pay for it. $15,000 for catering equipment, a commercial mixer, chafing, dishes, a portable warming station. For a business my aunt had been planning for years. The equipment sat in her garage for 6 months before she sold it privately. She sent me $800 from the sale. I told her to keep it. And then the smaller ones. The dental work for my brother, that he said he'd pay back by spring. The furnace repair for my aunt that turned into something else by the time the invoice cleared. The just help me until next month requests that never had a next month attached to them. I had been running a private support system for my family for the better part of my adult life. I had called it love. What I was beginning to understand, sitting at my kitchen table in the dark, was that they had never called it that. For them, I was a resource. I was accessible capital with a familiar face. And the moment they believed that resource had run dry, they didn't grieve a sister or a niece. They started calculating what might still be reachable. On the third day, I drove to my aunt's house in Brampton wearing a faded university hoodie and jeans. That had seen better days. I needed to see it. Whatever was left of the family I had spent so much of myself trying to hold together. My brother's Pathfinder was in the driveway. The kitchen renovation I'd never been told about was visible from the front walk. A new bay window where the old one had been. The kind of update that costs more than most people's way spend on a used car. Inside, the house smelled like something braised and expensive. My brother was at the kitchen island with a coffee. My aunt was at the stove. Neither of them moved toward me. My brother looked me up and down, and then he said, in the tone of someone who has rehearsed sympathy without quite landing it, "Honestly, Bridget, I always thought the money side of things would catch up with you eventually. You were never really a business person, you just had good timing." He said it like he was doing me a favor. Like this was honesty between us, finally. My aunt slid a bowl of cold soup across the island without asking if I wanted it warmed up. I sat down, I ate the soup. I stayed exactly long enough for what needed to happen. Before I left, I set my iPad on the island, face up, screen on, with a document open. The header read, "Confidential summary. Offshore holdings, do not distribute." I said I needed to use the washroom. I ran the tap. I watched through the crack in the door. They didn't wait for me to reach the end of the hall. My brother slid the iPad toward him and photographed every page with his phone. My aunt leaned over his shoulder, her finger tracing a column of numbers, her lips moving slightly. Their faces weren't worried. They weren't thinking about me at all. There was a specific light in their eyes. Bright and very particular. The look of people who believe they have found a shortcut to something they already feel they deserve. They did not know that every touch on that screen was being logged, on a synced device at home, where Reed was sitting quietly in our home office, watching the feed in real time. What Reed saw that evening changed the shape of everything. My brother had not only photographed the document, he had also, on that same session, navigated to the CRA's website and searched for a specific program. For anyone unfamiliar, the Canada Revenue Agency operates the Offshore Tax Informant program, which accepts tips about unreported offshore income and hidden foreign assets. Under the right circumstances, an informant can receive a financial award of up to 15% of the additional federal tax recovered. My brother had read the eligibility guidelines. He had done the math on what 15% of a recovered offshore account might represent. He was prepared to file a tip with the CRA alleging that his sister had been hiding taxable income offshore. He was prepared to attempt to put me in legal jeopardy if it meant a payout. Reed sat with that information for about 30 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called our accountant, Moira. What Moira found when she pulled my aunt's filing history was something my aunt had almost certainly stopped thinking about years ago. 8 years earlier, my aunt had registered a numbered company through Service Ontario, 1847392 Ontario Inc. For the catering business she'd been planning for as long as I could remember. The company had never actually operated, but it had never been dissolved either. It had simply gone dormant, sitting in the provincial registry, like a name on a piece of paper, nobody looked at anymore. The problem was what had accumulated in the silence since. Because the corporation had been registered for HST remittance purposes and had never formally closed, the CRA had been issuing non-filing notices for years. Those notices had been going to an old address. Over 8 years between the unremitted HST, accumulated interest and administrative penalties. The outstanding obligation attached to 1847392. Ontario Inc. had grown to $115,000. My aunt was the sole registered director. She was personally liable for every dollar. Moira reached out to my aunt through a contact that couldn't be traced back to us. She introduced herself as an independent tax liaison, the kind of consultant who helps individuals navigate CRA informant claims. She told my aunt that the offshore tax informant program gave significantly more weight to tips from informants who could demonstrate a direct financial connection to the activity being reported. If my aunt could provide a signed affidavit confirming she was the active director of a Canadian business entity, with historical ties to the accounts referenced in the offshore restructuring documents, her tip would carry far more credibility. And the potential award, Moira implied, would be proportional. My aunt did not ask many questions. She had always believed, in some deep and unexamined part of herself, that the right signature on the right form was the thing standing between her and the life she felt she was owed. She signed an affidavit, under oath, confirming that she was the current active sole director of 1847392 Ontario Inc., and that the corporation had been conducting ongoing business activities. She thought she was signing herself into a share of my money. She had actually just reactivated a dormant corporation with $115,000 in outstanding CRA obligations, effective the date of her signature. Reed sent them each a formal letter 2 days later. The language was precise and official. The kind of letter that makes people feel certain they are about to receive something. He told them that a final review of retained assets was taking place at a legal office downtown, and that their presence was requested as family members with potential claims on disclosed holdings. They came dressed for it. My brother wore the blazer he saved for things that mattered. My aunt was in heels, and the handbag I had given her 3 birthdays ago. They walked into that boardroom like people who had already decided, in some private and certain corner of themselves, what they were going to do with the afternoon. I was standing at the far end of the table. Reed was beside me. Moira was there with her briefcase open, and next to her sat a collections officer from the CRA, who had been contacted once we had everything assembled, and who had agreed, given the circumstances of the dormant corporation and the outstanding liabilities, to attend. My aunt smiled when she walked in. She looked past me entirely and addressed the officer directly. She said she was there to follow up on her informant claim and to discuss the status of her potential award. The officer asked my aunt to confirm the signature on the affidavit she had provided, in which she attested to being the current active sole director of 1847392 Ontario Inc. My aunt confirmed it. She was still smiling. The officer opened a folder. She explained, in the measured tone of someone who delivers difficult information professionally, that by signing and submitting an affidavit confirming current active directorship of 1847392 Ontario Inc., my aunt had legally reactivated the corporation's standing with the CRA and assumed full personal liability for all outstanding obligations. This included $84,000 in unremitted HST, $21,000 in accumulated interest, and $9,600 in administrative penalties. A lien had been registered against the Brampton property as of that morning. The silence that followed was the most complete thing I have ever heard. My aunt's hand went to the edge of the table. I watched her grip it. My brother's blazer suddenly looked too large for him. As for his offshore tax informant program submission, the CRA had reviewed the offshore restructuring document and found no corresponding entities or accounts in any international exchange database. The document had no connection to any actual financial holdings. The tip had been flagged as potentially fraudulent. Under OTIP guidelines, submitting a knowingly false tip is treated as a serious matter. My brother was now a person of interest in his own right, and a preliminary review of his personal tax filings had already surfaced 3 years of unreported contract income, e-transfers from clients he had never declared. I did not explain any of this to them in that room. The officer had already said everything that needed saying. I walked out of that office building into a gray November afternoon that smelled like wet pavement and approaching winter. Reed held the door. I did not look back. I went to my aunt's house in Brampton. One final time, 3 days later. A formal notice from the CRA was already visible through the front door glass, sitting on the entryway table. The farmhouse sink was still gleaming. The quartz countertops were still beautiful. None of it was going to matter. My aunt was in the kitchen when I came in. She turned around when she heard me. She said she needed me to understand that she had been frightened, that she had been trying to protect herself, and that surely, I could see how terrifying it was to think that everything might disappear overnight. She said that as family, she deserved a second chance. She held out her hand. I looked at her for a long moment. I'm filing for bankruptcy protection, remember? I said. I don't have anything to give. It was the most honest sentence I had spoken in that kitchen in years. I crossed to the shelf by the back window where it had always sat, my grandmother's wooden recipe box. Small, dented, the brass latch no longer closing properly. Every card inside was in my grandmother's handwriting. Butter tarts, cabbage rolls, a lemon pudding cake she made every Easter, a borscht recipe annotated in the margins in pencil. My aunt had kept it the way people keep things they feel entitled to but have never actually valued. She had not cooked from a single card in it. I had watched it sit on that shelf for 20 years, and I had never once asked for it, because I thought asking would make it a fight. I picked it up. My aunt opened her mouth. I looked at her and she closed it again. In the sunroom at the back, my aunt's cat, old, orange, arthritic in both back legs, a creature who had been padding around that house for 15 years and answering to nothing in particular, was asleep on the radiator. My aunt had made no arrangements for him. He was simply another loose end in a life that was being taken apart. I had already spoken to Paulette, a friend of mine in Mississauga, who fostered animals through a local rescue organization. She had agreed to take him permanently, with a written care commitment and a check drawn on a business account the CRA had no claim against. I picked him up carefully. He didn't protest. I carried him to the car along with the recipe box. I adjusted the mirror and pulled away from the curb, without looking at the house in the rear view. The final CRA assessment came 4 months later. My aunt's property was sold through a provincial tax lien enforcement process. Proceeds applied to the outstanding balance. There was not much left over. The cabinetry and the farmhouse sink went with the house. My brother's tax reassessment came to $34,000 in back taxes, interest, and late filing penalties. His OTIP submission was formally closed as unsubstantiated, with a notation made to his CRA account. In February, I received a letter in my brother's handwriting, on plain paper, asking me to explain myself. He said I had manipulated the situation. He said a real sister would have warned him. He said he didn't recognize who I had become. I read it once. Then I fed it through the shredder we keep in the home office and watched it come out the other side in thin, even strips. What I felt in that moment was not what I expected. I had braced for anger, or the particular grief of a relationship that has finally and officially ended, or the old familiar guilt that had followed me through most of my adult life, like a weather system I had learned to navigate around. What I felt instead was something quieter than any of those things. Something without particular texture or weight. The specific absence of a burden I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten it was there. I'm writing this from our kitchen, where the morning light comes through the window and lands on the shelf above the radiator. My grandmother's recipe box is there, the latch still broken, the cards still in her handwriting. The cat is asleep beside it. Reed is in the next room, on a call, asking questions in that patient and methodical way he has. The way that tells you he has already found the thing worth questioning and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. There are things I know now that I didn't know on that Thursday afternoon in November when I stared at a number until the screen went dark. I know that the people who love you for your money have never actually been loving you. They have been managing an asset, and the moment that asset appeared to be gone, they didn't grieve a sister or a niece. They reached for whatever they thought they could still carry out the door. I know that if the thought of telling someone you've lost everything fills you with dread, not dread of the situation itself, but dread of their reaction, that feeling is not weakness. That feeling is information. It is telling you something you already know about what this relationship has always been. Underneath everything, you chose to believe about it. I know that greed does not need your help to run its course. My brother and my aunt did not need me to ruin them. They managed that entirely on their own, in the time it took to photograph a document and sign a piece of paper without reading a single line of it. And I know that you are allowed to leave. You are allowed to build something and keep it. You are allowed to draw a line between the family you were born into and the family you choose. And to understand that blood is a biological fact, not a debt that compounds interest in perpetuity. My name is Bridget. I have $4.2 million in accounts that belong only to me, a husband who has seen me clearly since the night we met, and a wooden recipe box with a broken latch that smells faintly of cardamom and holds the only handwriting I have ever fully trusted. For the first time in my adult life, everything I have is entirely, unmistakably mine.